Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through the life of a man whose very name became synonymous with absolute power, whose deeds echo through the corridors of history, and whose assassination changed the course of civilization forever. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of Gaius Julius Caesar, a figure so monumental that his legacy shaped not only the Roman Empire, but the very concept of leadership itself. As you settle into your comfortable position, allow your breathing to slow and deepen, like the steady rhythm of Roman legions marching along ancient roads. Feel the tensions of the modern world fade away, replaced by the timeless drama of ambition, love, betrayal, and destiny that defined the final century of the Roman Republic. Tonight, you are not merely a listener, but a silent witness to one of history's most compelling stories. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the Forum Romanum at the height of Roman power, when marble temples gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun and the voices of senators debated the fate of nations. The air is filled with the scent of burning incense from nearby temples, the sound of fountains playing in marble courtyards, and the distant murmur of a city that ruled the known world. We will follow Caesar's journey from his birth in the Subura, Rome's most notorious neighborhood, to his death on the floor of the Senate House, beneath the statue of his great rival Pompey. We will witness his transformation from a young patrician with political ambitions to the most powerful man in the world, a figure who stood at the crossroads between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Let your mind drift like a gentle breeze across the 7 hills of Rome, from the bustling streets where Caesar learned the art of politics, to the distant battlefields of Gaul where he forged his legend as a military commander. We will explore the paradoxes of this complex man, the populist who became a dictator, the republican who destroyed the republic, the lover who conquered hearts as easily as he conquered nations. Tonight, we will discover why Caesar's name became the word for emperor in dozens of languages, why his crossing of a small river became a metaphor for irrevocable decision, and why his death on the Ides of March remains one of history's most dramatic moments. As we journey through his remarkable life, let the story wash over you like the warm waters of a Roman bath, carrying you peacefully toward the shores of sleep while enriching your mind with the tale of a man who dared to reach for godhood and, for a brief, brilliant moment, almost grasped it. Ciao. Chapter 1. Child of the Subura, 100 to 85 BCE. Our story begins not in a palace or a villa, but in the crowded, noisy streets of the Subura, one of Rome's most densely populated and notorious neighborhoods. It was here, on July 13th, 100 BCE, that Gaius Julius Caesar was born into a world of contradictions. A patrician family living in a plebeian district, ancient nobility struggling with modern realities, and a republic that was slowly transforming into something entirely different. Picture, if you will, the Rome of Caesar's childhood, a city of perhaps 1 million souls, the largest urban center the world had ever known. The Subura, where the Caesar family made their home, was a maze of narrow streets and towering apartment buildings called insulae, where the wealthy lived on the ground floors and the poor climbed ever higher toward the sky. It was a neighborhood of taverns and brothels, of artisans and merchants, of freedmen and slaves, a microcosm of the Roman world in all its complexity and vitality. The Caesar family, despite their patrician status, was not among Rome's wealthiest or most powerful clans. They claimed descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas, making them descendants of the goddess Venus herself, a lineage that young Gaius would never forget and would later use to great political advantage. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a competent but unremarkable politician who served as praetor and governor of Asia. His mother, Aurelia, came from a more politically prominent family and was known throughout Rome for her intelligence, strength of character, and devotion to her children. Imagine young Caesar as a boy, walking through the bustling streets of the Subura with his mother, observing the incredible diversity of the Roman world. Here, a Syrian merchant hawked exotic spices from the east. There, a Germanic slave carried water from the public fountain. Greek tutors taught the children of the wealthy, while Egyptian priests performed mysterious rites in hidden temples. It was an education in humanity that no formal schooling could provide, and it shaped Caesar's understanding of the cosmopolitan nature of Roman power. The political atmosphere of Caesar's youth was charged with tension and violence. The social war, the conflict between Rome and its Italian allies, raged during his childhood, followed by the bitter civil wars between Marius and Sulla. These conflicts brought the reality of political violence directly into Caesar's world. His uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, the great general and populist leader, while his family's connections placed them squarely in the faction that would eventually lose to Sulla's aristocratic party. Caesar's education followed the traditional Roman pattern for a boy of his class. He studied rhetoric and oratory, the essential skills for any Roman politician, under the finest teachers available. He learned Greek, the language of culture and philosophy, and immersed himself in the works of Homer, Plato, and the great dramatists. But perhaps more importantly, he learned the art of speaking to crowds, of swaying opinion, of making himself heard above the din of Roman political life. The young Caesar was noted for his exceptional intelligence and his almost supernatural charisma. Even as a boy, he possessed the ability to command attention, to make people listen when he spoke. His tutors remarked on his quick wit, his prodigious memory, and his talent for languages. But they also noted something else, an ambition that seemed to burn within him like a flame, a desire for greatness that set him apart from his peers. As you continue to relax and drift towards sleep, picture the teenage Caesar standing on the Palatine Hill, looking out over the city that would one day bow to his will. The forum spreads below him, filled with the white togas of senators and the colorful robes of foreign ambassadors. In the distance, he can see the Campus Martius, where Roman armies gather before marching off to conquer new lands. The boy does not yet know what destiny awaits him, but he feels its stirrings in his soul, a whisper of greatness that will grow into a roar that will shake the foundations of the world. Chapter 2: The Making of a Politician, 84 to 69 BCE. The transition from boyhood to manhood for a young Roman aristocrat was marked by the ceremony of taking the toga virilis, the white toga of adult citizenship. For Caesar, this moment came during one of the most dangerous periods in Roman history, when the dictator Sulla was conducting his bloody proscriptions, systematically eliminating his political enemies and anyone who might threaten his power. Caesar's family connections made him a target. His uncle Marius had been Sulla's greatest enemy, and Caesar himself had married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, another of Sulla's opponents. When Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce his wife as a test of loyalty, the young man made the first great decision of his political career. He refused. It was an act of remarkable courage for someone barely out of his teens, and it nearly cost him his life. Picture the scene as Caesar, now 18 years old, stands before Sulla's representatives, his jaw set with determination, his eyes blazing with defiance. Around him, the most powerful men in Rome are begging for their lives, offering bribes, making promises, abandoning their principles to survive. But Caesar, this young man who has barely begun to live, chooses honor over safety, love over expedience. "I will not divorce my wife," he declares. And in those words, we hear the voice of the man who will one day challenge the gods themselves. Sulla's response was swift and merciless. Caesar was stripped of his inheritance. His wife's dowry was confiscated, and his name was added to the proscription lists, a death sentence that could be carried out by any citizen. For months, Caesar lived as a fugitive, hiding in the countryside, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of Sulla's assassins. It was during this period of exile that he learned lessons that would serve him throughout his life. The value of loyalty, the importance of personal relationships, and the knowledge that in politics there are moments when one must risk everything. Eventually, through the intervention of powerful friends and family members, Caesar's name was removed from the proscription lists. Sulla, it was said, agreed to spare the young man's life, but issued a prophetic warning. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. The dictator, with his keen political instincts, had recognized something in the young patrician that others had missed. A potential for greatness that could one day threaten the established order. With his life no longer in immediate danger, Caesar made another crucial decision. He would leave Rome and seek his fortune in the East. Military service was an essential step in any Roman political career, and Caesar chose to serve under Marcus Thermus, the governor of Asia. It was here, in the Greek cities of Asia Minor, that Caesar first tasted the intoxicating mixture of power and responsibility that came with Roman command. His first military assignment took him to the court of Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, where he was sent to negotiate for naval support. The mission was successful, but it also gave birth to rumors that would follow Caesar for the rest of his life. His enemies would later claim that his relationship with the elderly king had been more than diplomatic, using these allegations to attack his reputation and his masculinity. Caesar's response to these slanders was characteristic. He ignored them when possible and faced them down with wit and courage when necessary. The young Caesar's military career continued with distinction. At the siege of Mytilene, he was awarded the Civic Crown, Rome's highest military decoration, for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. Picture the scene as the 20-year-old Caesar, his armor stained with blood and dust, carries a wounded comrade to safety while enemy arrows whistle around him. It was an act of personal courage that established his reputation as a soldier and a leader, qualities that would prove essential in the years to come. But Caesar's true education was taking place not on the battlefield, but in the complex world of Roman politics and diplomacy. In the Greek cities of the East, he learned to navigate the intricate relationships between Roman governors and local elites, to understand the delicate balance between Roman power and provincial autonomy. He studied the art of administration, the science of taxation, and the subtle mechanisms by which Rome maintained control over its vast empire. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar began to develop his own political philosophy during these formative years. He saw how Roman rule could bring prosperity and stability to conquered peoples, but he also witnessed the corruption and brutality that too often accompanied Roman power. He began to envision a different kind of empire, one based not merely on force, but on the consent of the governed, on the integration of diverse peoples into a single, unified state. As you sink deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine the young Caesar standing on the deck of a ship as it sails across the wine-dark Aegean Sea, returning him to Rome after his years of service in the East. The sun is setting behind the distant mountains of Greece, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He is 25 years old, a veteran of war and diplomacy, a man who has faced death and emerged stronger. In his mind, he carries the seeds of the ideas that will one day transform the Roman world. But for now, he is simply a young politician returning home to begin the long climb up the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman political advancement. Chapter 3: The Rise to Power, 69 to 60 BCE. Caesar's return to Rome marked the beginning of his systematic assault on the heights of Roman political power. The Rome he found upon his return was a city transformed by wealth and conquest, but also torn by the growing tensions between the traditional aristocracy and the rising power of ambitious generals and populist politicians. It was a world perfectly suited to Caesar's talents and ambitions. His first major political office was that of quaestor, the lowest rung on the ladder of Roman magistracies, which he held in 69 BCE. The position took him to Spain, where he served under the governor and gained his first real experience in provincial administration. But it was during this posting that Caesar experienced what he would later describe as a moment of profound revelation about his own destiny. Picture Caesar standing before a statue of Alexander the Great in a temple in Gades, modern-day Cadiz. He is 30 years old, the same age at which Alexander had conquered the known world and died, leaving behind an empire that stretched from Macedonia to India. As Caesar contemplates the marble features of the great conqueror, he is said to have wept, overcome by the realization that while Alexander had achieved immortal glory by his 30th year, Caesar himself had accomplished nothing of lasting significance. It was a moment of self-awareness that would drive him for the rest of his life. Returning to Rome, Caesar threw himself into the political arena with characteristic energy and brilliance. He understood that in the Roman system, success required not just talent, but also money, connections, and the ability to appeal to the masses. He began to cultivate all three with methodical precision, borrowing enormous sums to finance public games and spectacles, building relationships with influential senators and businessmen, and developing his skills as an orator and public speaker. His election as aedile in 65 BCE gave him the opportunity to display his talents for public entertainment on a grand scale. The aediles were responsible for organizing the public games and festivals that were so important to Roman political life, and Caesar spared no expense in creating spectacles that would be remembered for years to come. He staged gladiatorial contests featuring hundreds of fighters, theatrical performances with the finest actors, and wild beast hunts that brought exotic animals from the far corners of the empire to the arenas of Rome. But Caesar's games were more than mere entertainment. They were carefully calculated political statements. By providing free spectacles for the Roman people, he was positioning himself as a champion of the masses, a politician who understood that in the increasingly democratic atmosphere of late Republican Rome, popular support was as important as aristocratic approval. The crowds who cheered his gladiators would remember his generosity when it came time to vote. The financial cost of these spectacles was enormous, and Caesar went deeply into debt to pay for them. His creditors included some of the wealthiest men in Rome, including Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the city and a key figure in Roman politics. This debt was not merely a financial burden. It was a political investment that bound Caesar to powerful patrons and gave him access to the resources he would need for his continued advancement. Caesar's next major office was that of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, a position he won in 63 BCE through a combination of political maneuvering and popular appeal. The election was particularly significant because it was decided by popular vote rather than by the traditional college of priests, and Caesar's victory over two much more senior candidates demonstrated his growing influence with the Roman people. The office of Pontifex Maximus was more than a religious position. It was a key element in the Roman political system. As chief priest, Caesar was responsible for maintaining the Pax Diorum, the peace with the gods that was essential for Roman prosperity and success. He controlled the calendar, supervised religious festivals, and had the authority to interpret religious law. Most importantly, the position was held for life, giving Caesar a permanent place in the Roman establishment, regardless of his political fortunes. It was during this period that Caesar became involved in one of the most dramatic political crises of the late Republic, the Catiline conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a desperate and debt-ridden aristocrat, had organized a plot to overthrow the government and cancel all debts. The conspiracy was exposed by the consul Cicero, and in the dramatic Senate debate that followed, Caesar found himself walking a political tightrope. Picture the scene in the Senate House as Cicero delivers his famous speeches against Catiline, his voice ringing with righteous indignation as he exposes the details of the plot. The senators sit in stunned silence as they learn how close Rome has come to revolution and civil war. When the debate turns to the punishment of the conspirators, Caesar rises to speak, his voice calm and measured in contrast to Cicero's passionate rhetoric. Caesar's speech was a masterpiece of political calculation. While condemning the conspiracy, he argued against the death penalty for the conspirators, proposing instead life imprisonment and confiscation of property. His position was both principled and pragmatic. Principled because it upheld the traditional Roman prohibition against executing citizens without trial, and pragmatic because it avoided setting a precedent that could later be used against populist politicians like himself. The speech nearly cost Caesar his life. As he left the Senate House, a crowd of angry knights, convinced that he was secretly sympathetic to Catiline, surrounded him with drawn swords. Only the intervention of Cicero himself saved Caesar from being lynched on the spot. It was a reminder of how dangerous Roman politics had become, and how quickly a politician's fortunes could change. As you continue your peaceful journey towards sleep, imagine Caesar in his house in the Subura on the night after the Catiline debate, sitting alone in his study as oil lamps flicker in the darkness. He has survived another political crisis, but he knows that greater challenges lie ahead. In his mind, he is already planning his next move, his campaign for the consulship, the highest office in the Roman state. He understands that he stands at a crossroads. Success will bring him the power and glory he has always sought, but failure could mean exile, disgrace, or death. The stakes could not be higher, and Caesar has never been one to shy away from a gamble. And Chapter 4, the First Triumvirate, 6058 BCE. By 60 BCE, Caesar had reached a crucial moment in his political career. He had served as praetor and governor of further Spain, where he had won military victories against local tribes and enriched himself through conquest and administration. Now he sought the consulship, the highest office in the Roman Republic, but he faced a fundamental problem. His enemies in the Senate were determined to block his path to power. The Roman political system was designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power, and the conservative senators, led by figures like Cato the Younger, saw Caesar as a dangerous populist who threatened the traditional order. They used every procedural trick at their disposal to frustrate his ambitions, forcing him to choose between celebrating a triumph for his Spanish victories and running for consul. Roman law prohibited him from doing both. Caesar's response was characteristically bold and innovative. If the system would not allow him to achieve his goals through traditional means, he would create a new system. In secret negotiations that would reshape the Roman world, he forged an alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Picture the clandestine meeting where this alliance was born, perhaps in a villa outside Rome, where the three men could speak without fear of being overheard. Pompey, the greatest general of his generation, sits across from Crassus, the richest man in Rome, while Caesar, the youngest and least accomplished of the three, serves as the architect of their partnership. Each man brings something essential to the alliance. Pompey, his military prestige and veteran soldiers, Crassus, his vast wealth and business connections, and Caesar, his political skills and popular support. The alliance, which historians would later call the First Triumvirate, was not a formal institution, but a private agreement among three ambitious men to pool their resources and support each other's goals. For Pompey, It meant the ratification of his eastern settlements and land grants for his veterans. For Crassus, it promised favorable legislation for his business interests and the tax farmers he represented. For Caesar, it guaranteed his election as consul and the provincial command he needed to build his own military reputation. The Triumvirate's first test came with Caesar's consular election in 59 BCE. Despite the opposition of the conservative faction, Caesar was elected alongside Marcus Bibulus, a staunch opponent who had been chosen by the Optimates to serve as a check on Caesar's power. What followed was one of the most extraordinary years in Roman political history, as Caesar systematically dismantled the opposition and pushed through his agenda with a combination of legal maneuvering, popular pressure, and outright intimidation. Caesar's consulship was marked by a series of dramatic confrontations that revealed the growing breakdown of the Roman constitutional system. When Bibulus attempted to veto Caesar's legislation, Caesar had him physically removed from the forum. When the conservative senators tried to obstruct his proposals through religious technicalities, Caesar ignored their objections and appealed directly to the popular assemblies. The year became known as the consulship of Julius and Caesar because Bibulus was so thoroughly marginalized that he spent most of his term barricaded in his house, issuing ineffective edicts that no one heeded. But Caesar's most important achievement during his consulship was securing for himself the governorship of Gaul, a province that would provide him with the opportunity to build the military reputation and personal wealth he needed to compete with Pompey and Crassus on equal terms. The Gallic command was not just a political prize, it was a chance for Caesar to prove himself as a general and to win the kind of glory that could only come from conquest and victory in battle. The alliance between the three men was cemented by a marriage that was both personal and political. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia, a union that bound the two men together through ties of family as well as mutual interest. Julia was young, beautiful, and intelligent, and despite the political nature of the marriage, she and Pompey appear to have developed a genuine affection for each other. For Caesar, the marriage represented the sacrifice of his beloved daughter to the demands of political necessity, but it also secured his alliance with the most powerful general in Rome. As Caesar prepared to leave for Gaul, he took steps to protect his interests during his absence. He arranged for friendly tribunes to watch over his affairs in Rome, and he made sure that his allies Pompey and Crassus would continue to support his legislation and defend his actions against his enemies. He also began to recruit the officers and soldiers who would serve under him in Gaul, choosing men who were personally loyal to him and who shared his vision of Roman expansion and glory. The night before his departure for Gaul, Caesar is said to have had a prophetic dream in which he saw himself crossing a small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy. In the dream, the crossing of this river, the Rubicon, brought about momentous consequences that would change the course of Roman history. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a curious vision, but it would prove to be one of the most prescient dreams in history. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine Caesar on the morning of his departure from Rome, standing in the atrium of his house as the first light of dawn filters through the opening in the roof. He is 41 years old, at the height of his powers, ready to embark on the adventure that will make his name immortal. Around him, his household slaves are loading wagons with his personal belongings, while his officers wait outside to escort him to his new command. He takes one last look at the city that has been his home, his arena, his obsession, knowing that when he returns, he will be a different man, and Rome itself will be forever changed. Chapter 5. The Conquest of Gaul, 5850 BCE. Caesar's arrival in Gaul marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable military campaigns in ancient history. The Gaul he encountered was not a single nation, but a patchwork of Celtic tribes. Some allied to Rome, others fiercely independent, all bound together by complex relationships of kinship, rivalry, and shifting political alliances. It was a land of warriors and druids, of fortified hilltop settlements called oppida, and of a proud people who had never known the yoke of foreign domination. The pretext for Caesar's intervention came from the Helvetii, a Swiss tribe that had decided to migrate westward across Gaul in search of new lands. Their movement threatened to destabilize the entire region, and Caesar, seizing the opportunity, moved quickly to block their passage. The confrontation that followed would set the pattern for the next 8 years. Caesar would use his superior discipline, tactics, and engineering skills to defeat enemies who often outnumbered his forces by enormous margins. Picture the Battle of Bibracte in 58 BCE, Caesar's first major victory in Gaul. The Helvetii, 250,000 strong, have been forced to turn and fight after Caesar's legions blocked their westward migration. The Celtic warriors, brave and fierce, charge up the hillside toward the Roman lines, their war cries echoing across the battlefield, their long swords glinting in the afternoon sun. But they meet a wall of Roman shields and steel, a disciplined formation that bends but does not break, and by evening the Helvetii are in full retreat, their dreams of conquest shattered. Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, written in his spare time during the campaigns, provides us with an unparalleled window into the mind of a military genius at work. His prose is clear, precise, and deceptively modest, describing his victories with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. But beneath the surface, simplicity, lies a sophisticated understanding of strategy, logistics, and the psychology of warfare that marks Caesar as one of history's greatest military commanders. The conquest of Gaul was not achieved in a single campaign, but through a series of interconnected wars that gradually extended Roman control over the entire region. After defeating the Helvetii, Caesar turned his attention to Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine and established himself in eastern Gaul. The confrontation with Ariovistus was as much psychological as military, as Caesar had to overcome his own soldiers' fear of the legendary Germanic warriors before he could defeat the enemy in battle. Each campaign brought new challenges and new opportunities for Caesar to display his tactical brilliance. Against the Belgae, the fiercest of the Gallic tribes, he used a combination of diplomacy and military pressure to divide his enemies and defeat them piecemeal. Against the Nervii, who nearly destroyed his army in a surprise attack, he personally rallied his troops and turned near defeat into stunning victory. Against the maritime tribes of the Atlantic coast, he built a fleet and fought the first naval battles in Roman history in northern waters. But perhaps Caesar's greatest military achievement was his conquest of the Gallic stronghold of Alesia in 52 BCE, where he faced the united forces of Gaul under their charismatic leader Vercingetorix. The siege of Alesia was a masterpiece of military engineering, as Caesar's legions built a double line of fortifications, one to keep the defenders in, another to keep the relieving army out, and then fought off attacks from both directions simultaneously. Picture the climactic moment of the siege as Vercingetorix, the young Gallic chieftain who had united his people in a final desperate resistance to Roman rule, realizes that his cause is lost. From the walls of Alesia, he can see Caesar's legions holding their lines against overwhelming odds, their discipline and training proving superior to Gallic courage and determination. In a gesture of noble sacrifice, Vercingetorix surrenders himself to Caesar, hoping to save his people from the full fury of Roman vengeance. The conquest of Gaul brought Caesar enormous wealth, military glory, and a veteran army that was personally loyal to him rather than to the Roman state. The gold and slaves taken in the campaigns made him one of the richest men in Rome, while his victories established his reputation as a general equal to Pompey or any of the great commanders of the past. Most importantly, his 8 years in Gaul had transformed him from a politician into a warlord, a man who commanded the absolute loyalty of battle-tested legions. But Caesar's success in Gaul also created new problems for him in Rome. His enemies in the Senate, led by Cato and supported by a growing faction of conservatives, were determined to bring him down when his governorship expired. They planned to prosecute him for the illegal acts he had committed during his consulship, knowing that conviction would mean exile and the end of his political career. Caesar's only protection was his imperium, his legal authority as a provincial governor, which made him immune from prosecution as long as he remained in office. The political crisis came to a head in 50 BCE, as Caesar's governorship neared its end and his enemies maneuvered to force him to return to Rome as a private citizen, vulnerable to prosecution and political destruction. Caesar's request to be allowed to stand for consul in absentia, which would have allowed him to move directly from his governorship to a new consulship without the dangerous interval as a private citizen, were repeatedly rejected by the Senate. As the year 50 BCE drew to a close, it became clear that Caesar faced a stark choice. He could return to Rome and face almost certain prosecution and exile, or he could defy the Senate and march on Rome with his army. It was a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the Roman Republic itself. As you continue your peaceful journey towards sleep, imagine Caesar in his winter quarters in Gaul, sitting by a fire as snow falls outside his tent. Around him, his officers discuss the latest dispatches from Rome, their voices low and urgent as they debate the political crisis that threatens to destroy everything they have built together. Caesar listens in silence, his mind weighing the options, calculating the risks, preparing for the decision that will make him either the savior or the destroyer of the Roman Republic.
In the distance, a river flows quietly through the darkness. The Rubicon, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, between provincial command and open rebellion, between the old world and the new.
Chapter 6. Crossing the Rubicon, 49 BCE. The winter of 50-49 BCE was one of the most tense and dramatic periods in Roman history, as the Republic teetered on the brink of civil war.
In Rome, Caesar's enemies in the Senate, emboldened by their success in blocking his attempts to stand for consul in absentia, moved to strip him of his command and force his return as a private citizen. In Gaul, Caesar weighed his options with the cold calculation of a master strategist, knowing that his next decision would determine not only his own fate, but the future of Rome itself.
The final break came on January 1st, 49 BCE, when the consul Lentulus read a letter from Caesar to the Senate. In measured, respectful language, Caesar outlined his achievements in Gaul, his service to the Roman people, and his reasonable requests for fair treatment.
He offered to disband his armies if Pompey would do the same, to return to Rome as a private citizen if he could be guaranteed protection from his enemies' prosecutions. It was a final attempt at compromise, a last chance to avoid the catastrophe of civil war. The Senate's response was swift and uncompromising. Led by Cato, who declared that he would rather die than compromise with Caesar, they passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree that effectively declared martial law and authorized the consuls to take any measures necessary to protect the state. For Caesar, the message was clear: submit to prosecution and exile, or be declared an enemy of Rome. Picture Caesar as he receives the news of the Senate's decision, standing in his headquarters at Ravenna, just south of the Rubicon River that marked the boundary between his Gallic province and Italy proper. Around him, his most trusted officers, Mark Antony, who had fled Rome to bring him the news, Asinius Pollio, the historian who would record these momentous events, Gaius Scribonius Curio, the young tribune who had become one of his most devoted supporters, wait for his response. The room is silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of soldiers going about their duties, unaware that their commander is about to make a decision that will change the world. Caesar's deliberation was brief but intense. He had spent his entire adult life working within the Roman system, climbing the ladder of offices, respecting the traditions and customs that had made Rome great. But that same system was now being used to destroy him, wielded by men who cared more about preserving their own power than about justice or the good of the state. If the Republic would not protect him, then perhaps it was time for the Republic to change. The decision, when it came, was characteristically bold and decisive. Caesar would not submit to his enemies' demands. Instead, he would march on Rome with his army, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing the Roman people from the tyranny of a corrupt oligarchy. It was a gamble of enormous proportions, staking everything on a single throw of the dice. But Caesar had never been one to shy away from risk when the potential rewards were great enough. The crossing of the Rubicon took place on the night of January 10, 49 BCE, in circumstances that have become the stuff of legend. Caesar, accompanied by a single legion, the 13th, his most loyal and experienced troops, approached the small river that marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy. According to ancient sources, he paused on the northern bank, fully aware of the magnitude of the step he was about to take. Suetonius tells us that Caesar spent long hours in contemplation, weighing the consequences of his decision. To cross the Rubicon with his army would be an act of treason, a violation of the sacred law that prohibited a general from bringing armed forces into Italy. There would be no turning back, no possibility of reconciliation with his enemies. He would be committed to civil war with all its attendant horrors and uncertainties. But Caesar was also a man who believed in destiny, who felt that the gods had marked him for greatness. As he stood on the banks of the Rubicon, he is said to have seen a vision, a figure of superhuman size and beauty who took a trumpet from one of the soldiers and blew a blast that echoed across the water. Taking this as a divine sign, Caesar made his final decision. "Alea iacta est," he declared, "the die is cast," and spurred his horse into the shallow waters of the Rubicon. Behind him, the 13th Legion followed, their hobnailed sandals splashing through the stream that would give its name to any irrevocable decision. In that moment, the Roman Republic began its transformation into the Roman Empire, though none of the participants could have foreseen the full consequences of their actions. The immediate aftermath of the crossing was almost anticlimactic. Caesar's first target was the town of Ariminum, modern Rimini, which he captured without resistance. The local magistrates, faced with the choice between opposing Caesar's veteran legions or welcoming him as a liberator, chose the latter. Word of Caesar's invasion spread rapidly throughout Italy, but instead of the fierce resistance his enemies had expected, Caesar found himself welcomed by many communities that had grown tired of the Senate's misrule. Pompey, who had been appointed by the Senate to defend Italy against Caesar's invasion, found himself in an impossible position. His own legions were scattered across the empire, and the troops available to him in Italy were largely untested recruits. Faced with Caesar's rapid advance and the apparent support of many Italian communities for his cause, Pompey made the fateful decision to abandon Italy and retreat to the east, where he could gather his forces and prepare for a longer campaign. The speed of Caesar's advance and Pompey's retreat shocked the Roman world. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had gained control of all Italy without fighting a single major battle. The Senate and most of the aristocracy fled Rome, leaving the city to Caesar and his supporters. It was a bloodless revolution that demonstrated both Caesar's military genius and the weakness of the republican system he was overthrowing. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine Caesar entering Rome for the first time as its master, riding through streets lined with cheering crowds who see him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The sun shines brightly on the marble temples and monuments of the eternal city, while rose petals fall like snow from the windows of the houses lining his route. He has achieved what no Roman before him has ever accomplished. He has made himself master of Rome without destroying it, conqueror of the Republic
without becoming its enemy. But even in this moment of triumph, he knows that the hardest battles lie ahead, that Pompey and the forces of the old order will not surrender without a fight, and that the price of his victory may be higher than he can yet imagine. Maid, Chapter 7, Dictator of Rome, 49 to 44 BCE. Caesar's entry into Rome as master of the city marked the beginning of a new chapter in both his life and the history of the Roman world. The young man who had once been proscribed by Sulla, who had fled for his life through the Italian countryside, now stood at the pinnacle of power, holding in his hands the fate of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But with this power came responsibilities and challenges that would test even his extraordinary abilities. His first priority was to legitimize his position and win the support of the Roman people. Unlike previous civil war leaders who had seized power through violence and terror, Caesar chose a different path. He declared a general amnesty for his enemies, pardoned those who had opposed him, and made it clear that he sought not revenge, but reconciliation. It was a policy of clemency that would become one of the defining characteristics of his rule, though it would also prove to be one of his greatest vulnerabilities. Picture Caesar in the Senate House, addressing the few senators who had remained in Rome after Pompey's flight. His voice is calm and measured, his manner respectful of the ancient traditions and customs that had governed Roman political life for centuries. He speaks not as a conqueror, but as a reformer, outlining his vision for a renewed republic that would serve the interests of all Romans, not just the privileged few. Around him, the marble statues of ancient heroes seem to listen, their stone eyes witnessing the transformation of the world they had helped to create. But Caesar's clemency was not weakness, and his enemies soon learned that he was prepared to use force when necessary. The civil war that had begun with his crossing of the Rubicon would continue for 4 more years, as Caesar pursued Pompey and his supporters across the Mediterranean world. The campaign took him to Spain, where he defeated Pompey's lieutenants, to Africa, where he crushed the remnants of the Republican forces, and finally to Egypt, where the war reached its dramatic conclusion. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE was the decisive engagement of the civil war, pitting Caesar's veteran legions against Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, Caesar's tactical genius and the superior training of his troops carried the day. Pompey, the great general who had once been hailed as the new Alexander, fled the battlefield in defeat, his reputation shattered and his cause lost. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey led him to Egypt, where he encountered one of the most remarkable women in history, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Their meeting, which took place in Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BCE, was the beginning of a relationship that was both deeply personal and profoundly political, a love affair that would shape the destiny of 2 great civilizations. Imagine the scene as Cleopatra, then 21 years old, and engaged in a bitter civil war with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, has herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, wrapped in a carpet. As the carpet is unrolled, revealing the young queen in all her beauty and intelligence, Caesar sees not just a woman, but a kindred spirit, someone who, like himself, understands the intoxicating nature of power and the burden of greatness. Their eyes meet across the marble floor of the palace, and in that moment, the fate of Egypt is sealed. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was more than a romantic liaison.